What if I told you that right now, while you are listening to these words, there exists within you a temple that has never known lack or limitation. And in this temple, every single thing you have ever needed or will ever need is already prepared and waiting for you. And tonight, while you sleep, you can enter this inner temple and receive divine supply that flows to you as naturally as breath flows through your lungs. And what if I told you that this is not wishful thinking or positive psychology, but an actual spiritual technology that Florence Scovel Shinn discovered in the early 1900s when she was working with people who had lost everything in the great economic upheavals of that time. And she found that when people learned to access their inner temple during sleep, their external circumstances would begin to shift within 72 hours without effort or struggle, but simply through the natural law of spiritual correspondence that governs all manifestation in the physical plane. You can close your eyes now, and everything that needs to happen will happen while you rest, because your subconscious mind is already beginning to attune itself to the frequency of divine supply. And even if you fall completely asleep during this teaching, your deeper mind will absorb every word and every principle. And when you wake tomorrow morning, something within you will be different, not because you have gained something new, but because you will have remembered something ancient and eternal that was always yours by divine right. Let me tell you about Eleanor Watson, who was 68 years old when she first discovered this teaching about the inner temple, and Eleanor lived in a small house in Portland, Oregon, that had been in her family for 37 years, and she had lived there with her husband Harold for all of those years, until Harold passed away suddenly from a heart attack on a Tuesday morning in March while he was reading the newspaper at their kitchen table. And Eleanor found him there when she came back from her morning walk at 8:15 in the morning, and the newspaper was still folded to the business section, where Harold had been reading about the stock market, and his coffee was still warm in the blue ceramic mug that their daughter had given him for Christmas 3 years before. After Harold's funeral, Eleanor discovered that their financial situation was far worse than she had ever imagined, because Harold had been borrowing against the house to pay for his medical treatments and to keep up their standard of living, and the bank letters had been arriving for months. But Harold had been hiding them in a shoebox in the garage because he did not want Eleanor to worry. And when Eleanor finally found the letters and called the bank, she learned that they owed $43,712, and the house would go into foreclosure in 90 days if she could not bring the payments current. And Eleanor had exactly $847 in their checking account and no other income except Harold's Social Security, which had stopped when he died. Eleanor spent the first 2 weeks after discovering this sitting at her kitchen table, crying and staring at the stack of bills and bank notices, and she would pick up the phone to call her daughter Susan, who lived in Denver. But then she would put the phone down because she was too proud to ask for help and too ashamed to admit that Harold had hidden their financial troubles from her, and she felt angry at Harold for leaving her in this situation. But then she felt guilty for being angry at a dead man, and the guilt made her cry even harder. And she would go to bed each night with her mind racing and her heart pounding, and she would lie awake until 3 or 4 in the morning worrying about where she would live and how she would survive. It was on a Thursday evening in late March, when Eleanor was walking through the neighborhood trying to clear her head, that she saw a light on in the window of the old Victorian house where Mrs. Morrison lived. And Mrs. Morrison was 83 years old and had been a friend of Eleanor's mother many years before. And Eleanor had not spoken to Mrs. Morrison in several years. But something made her walk up to the front door and knock, and when Mrs. Morrison answered the door, she took one look at Eleanor's face and said, "Come in, dear. You look like you need some tea." And something told Eleanor to accept the invitation, even though she usually preferred to keep her troubles to herself. Mrs. Morrison made chamomile tea in delicate china cups, and she sat across from Eleanor in her living room, which was filled with old books and the smell of lavender. And she listened while Eleanor told her everything about Harold's death and the hidden debts and the foreclosure notice. And when Eleanor finished talking, Mrs. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "My dear, I am going to tell you something that saved my life when my husband died 40 years ago, and it may sound strange to you, but I want you to promise me you will try it for 7 nights. and Eleanor nodded because something in Mrs. Morrison's voice made her feel that this was important. Mrs. Morrison reached into a drawer in the side table and pulled out a small worn book, and she said this book was written by a woman named Florence Scovel Shinn, who lived in New York in the early 1900s, and she understood something about divine supply that most people never learn. And she said that within each of us, there is an inner temple where God has already prepared everything we need, and when we learn to enter this temple, especially during sleep, we can receive provision that seems to come from nowhere but is actually flowing from the infinite source that is always available to us. And Mrs. Morrison opened the book to a page that was marked with a faded ribbon, and she read these words in a voice that was soft but somehow filled with authority. She read, "Divine supply is not something you must earn or deserve, but something that is already yours by divine inheritance. And within your consciousness, there exists a temple that has never known lack. And in this temple, every need is already met before it arises. And when you align your sleeping mind with this temple reality, you become a channel through which infinite supply flows into your daily experience." And Mrs. Morrison closed the book and looked at Eleanor and said, "Every night before you sleep, I want you to say these words: I enter my inner temple now, and I receive divine supply while I rest, and then simply go to sleep, trusting that something is being arranged in the invisible realm." And Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest when she heard those words, as if a door that had been closed for a long time was beginning to open. Eleanor thanked Mrs. Morrison and walked home through the quiet streets, and that night, for the first time since Harold's death, she felt a strange sense of peace as she prepared for bed, and she said the words that Mrs. Morrison had taught her: "I enter my inner temple now, and I receive divine supply while I rest." And as she spoke these words, she could almost feel herself stepping through a doorway in her mind into a place of golden light and perfect provision. And she fell asleep more easily than she had in weeks. And she slept deeply, without waking until the morning sun came through her bedroom window. On Friday morning, Eleanor woke with an unusual feeling of calm and expectancy, as if something good was about to happen. But she tried not to get her hopes up, and she went about her normal routine of coffee and toast and checking the mail. And when she opened the mailbox, there was the usual collection of bills and advertisements, but there was also a thick envelope addressed to her in handwriting she did not recognize. And when she opened it, she found a letter from a lawyer in Seattle informing her that her great-aunt Mildred, who had died 6 months earlier, had left Eleanor an inheritance that had been delayed in probate, and the amount was $47,300, and Eleanor read the letter 3 times before she believed it was real. Eleanor had not even known that great-aunt Mildred existed, because Mildred was her grandmother's sister who had moved to Seattle in 1952, and the family had lost touch with her decades ago. And apparently, Mildred had never married and had no children, and she had remembered Eleanor in her will, because Eleanor was her only living relative. And the lawyer explained that he had been trying to locate Eleanor for months, but had only recently found her address through a genealogy service. And Eleanor sat down at her kitchen table with the letter in her hands, and she began to cry. But this time the tears were tears of gratitude and relief, and something deeper than relief, something like recognition, as if she had always known that this was possible, but had forgotten. Eleanor called the lawyer that afternoon and arranged for the inheritance to be transferred to her account, and within 1 week she was able to pay off all of Harold's debts and save the house. And she still had enough money left over to live comfortably for several years. And when she went to thank Mrs. Morrison and return the book, Mrs. Morrison smiled and said, "Keep the book, dear, because now you know the secret of the inner temple, and you can help others find their way there, just as Florence Scovel Shinn helped so many people discover that divine supply is not a miracle, but a natural law that works when we align our consciousness with the truth of our spiritual inheritance." If this teaching resonates with something deep inside you, and if you feel that you were guided to hear these words at this exact moment in your life, then touch the subscribe button now. And it is not for me, but it is so that you receive each new teaching from Florence Scovel Shinn at the exact moment your soul needs it most, because these teachings come through when people are ready to receive them. And your readiness is not an accident, but part of a divine plan that has been unfolding since before you were born. And when you subscribe, you join a community of souls who are learning to live from the consciousness of divine supply, rather than the consciousness of lack. And in the comments, write only these 4 words, which are, I enter the temple now. And this is not an affirmation or a hope, but a decree. And when you write these words, you activate a field of collective witness, and thousands of souls around the world write these same words, and the field strengthens for everyone because we are all connected in the realm of spirit. And what one person receives makes it easier for all others to receive. And your decree helps to anchor this. Teaching in the physical plane, where it can reach those who need it most. If you choose not to do this right now, that is perfectly fine, and your path is your own, and there is no judgment here. But know that this moment carries a special power, because you are hearing these words at a time when your consciousness is already shifting, and the inner temple is already beginning to open for you. And sometimes the greatest transformations happen when we take small actions that demonstrate our willingness to receive what is being offered to us freely. Now you can relax completely, and you do not need to do anything else except listen and allow these words to enter the deepest parts of your mind, where your true knowing lives. And even if you fall asleep in the next few minutes, that is perfect, because when you sleep, your ego mind steps aside and your soul mind awakens, and your soul already knows the way to the inner temple, because your soul has never left the temple but has only forgotten temporarily that this is where you truly live. And as you rest now, your remembering has already begun. Everything I will share with you over the next 2 hours enters you while you rest, and you do not need to memorize or analyze or understand with your thinking mind, because there is a part of you that is always awake, even when you sleep. And this part of you recognizes truth when it hears it and absorbs wisdom without effort. And when you wake tomorrow morning, you will find that something has shifted in your relationship to provision and supply, and lack will feel like an old dream that no longer has power over you, because you will have remembered your true identity as a temple dweller. Your subconscious mind is already beginning to reorganize itself around the frequency of divine supply. And this reorganization happens naturally when you stop trying to figure out how your needs will be met, and simply rest in the knowing that they are already met in the realm of spirit and manifestation in the physical world is simply the natural movement of what is already complete in the inner world. And as you continue listening, these words are creating new pathways in your consciousness that lead directly to the inner temple, where all good things await you. Now let me tell you about the remarkable woman who discovered this principle of the inner temple, and how her teachings have transformed thousands of lives over the past 100 years. And Florence Scovel Shinn was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1860, and she grew up in a world where women were expected to marry young and tend to their households and never concern themselves with matters of business or spiritual authority. But Florence was different from the beginning, and she had an inquiring mind and a deep hunger for truth that would not be satisfied by conventional religion or social expectations. Florence moved to New York City in the 1880s when she was a young woman, and she worked as an artist and illustrator, creating drawings for children's books and magazines. And she lived in a small apartment in Greenwich Village, where she was surrounded by other artists and writers and free thinkers who were exploring new ideas about consciousness and metaphysics and the power of the mind to influence physical reality. And Florence attended lectures by Emma Curtis Hopkins and other early New Thought teachers, and she began to experiment with the principles they taught about the connection between thought and some manifestation. It was during this time in New York that Florence began to notice something extraordinary happening in her own life and the lives of her friends. And she noticed that when people spoke with absolute conviction and authority about what they desired, as if it were already true, their circumstances would begin to shift in ways that seemed miraculous to outside observers, but felt completely natural to the person experiencing the shift. And Florence began to study this phenomenon with the careful attention of a scientist, and she started to document the patterns she observed. and to develop a systematic understanding of how spiritual law operates in the material world. Florence discovered that there were specific words and phrases that seemed to act as keys that unlocked what she came to call the inner temple of consciousness. And she found that when people learned to use these words with the proper understanding and feeling tone, they could access a level of knowing and receiving that bypassed all the usual limitations of external circumstances and logical possibility. And she began to teach small groups of people who gathered in her apartment in the evenings to learn what she called the science of right speaking and divine correspondence. The principle that became the foundation of all of Florence's work was this understanding that within each person's consciousness there exists a perfect pattern or template that contains the complete fulfillment of every desire and need. And this template exists in what she called the inner temple, which is not a place, but a level of awareness that recognizes the infinite abundance of the divine source that flows through all creation. And when a person learns to align their sleeping consciousness with this inner temple, they become a channel through which divine supply flows into their daily experience without strain or effort or manipulation. Florence taught that most people live their entire lives outside the temple of their own consciousness, begging for scraps from a world that appears to be separate from them, when in reality, everything they seek is already prepared and waiting inside the temple of their own divine nature. And the reason most people never discover this is because they have been taught to look outside themselves for provision and security, and they have forgotten that they are spiritual beings temporarily wearing physical bodies, and that their true home is in the realm of infinite possibility, where lack and limitation do not exist. One of the most powerful stories from Florence's early teaching days involved a Presbyterian minister named Reverend Johnston, who was 54 years old when he first heard Florence speak at a metaphysical gathering in Manhattan in 1903. And Reverend Johnston had been serving a small congregation in the Lower East Side for 12 years, and he was deeply troubled by the poverty and suffering he witnessed every day among his parishioners, and he had begun to question whether God truly cared about the material needs of ordinary people, or whether faith was supposed to be merely a comfort in the face of inevitable hardship. Reverend Johnston approached Florence after her lecture, and he told her about his crisis of faith and his frustration with trying to help his congregation when the church had no money for food programs or assistance for families who were struggling to pay rent and keep their children fed. And he said that he had been praying for guidance about whether he should leave the ministry altogether because he felt like he was offering people empty words while their real needs went unmet. And Florence listened to his story with great compassion. And then she asked him a question that changed the course of his life. She asked him whether he had ever considered that his congregation's poverty might be a reflection of his own consciousness of lack rather than a fixed reality that could not be changed. And she explained that when a spiritual leader truly understands divine supply and lives from the consciousness of the inner temple, their faith community naturally begins to experience greater provision because consciousness is contagious, and what one person truly knows becomes available to everyone in their sphere of influence. And Reverend Johnston was initially offended by this suggestion because he felt that she was blaming him for his congregation's suffering. But Florence explained that she was not speaking about blame, but about spiritual law, and she told him that if he would spend 1 week entering his inner temple before sleep and declaring the divine supply of his congregation as an already accomplished fact in the spiritual realm, he would begin to see evidence of this truth manifesting in the physical world. And she taught him to say, before sleep each night, I enter the inner temple now, and I behold the perfect provision of my spiritual family, and every need is met from the infinite source that flows through all creation, and what is true in spirit now manifests in form. Reverend Johnston was skeptical, but he was also desperate, and he decided to try Florence's suggestion for 7 nights. And on the first night, as he spoke the words, I enter the inner temple, Now he felt something shift in his chest, as if a tight knot was beginning to loosen, and he saw in his mind's eye his congregation surrounded by golden light and abundance, flowing to each family like streams of water flowing to thirsty ground. And he felt a peace and certainty that he had not experienced in years, and he slept more deeply than he had in months. On the second night, the feeling of peace was even stronger, and on the third night, he began to feel an excitement and expectancy, as if something wonderful was about to happen. And he found himself looking forward to his evening temple practice with the eagerness of a child waiting for Christmas morning. And during the day, he noticed that he felt more confident and joyful when he spoke to his parishioners, and several people commented that he seemed different somehow, more radiant and hopeful than they had seen him in a long time. On the fourth morning, while Reverend Johnston was preparing his sermon for the upcoming Sunday service, there was a knock at the rectory door, and when he opened it, he found a well-dressed gentleman who introduced himself as Mr. William Hartley and said that he had been walking past the church and felt compelled to stop and inquire about the congregation's needs. And Reverend Johnston invited Mr. Hartley inside, and they talked for over an hour about the church's mission and the challenges facing the community. And when Mr. Hartley left, he handed Reverend Johnston an envelope and said that he hoped this would be helpful. When Reverend Johnston opened the envelope, he found a bank draft for $12,000, along with a note that said, "I am led to make this donation anonymously, and I trust you will use it according to divine guidance for the highest good of your spiritual family." And Reverend Johnston sat down heavily in his chair and stared at the bank draft, because $12,000 was more money then. His church had ever had at one time, and it was enough to fund their food program for an entire year and provide assistance to dozens of families who were struggling financially. Reverend Johnston immediately thought of Florence's teaching about the inner temple, and he realized that what had seemed impossible just 4 days earlier had manifested with perfect timing, and in a way that he never could have planned or orchestrated. And he understood for the first time that divine supply does not come through human effort or manipulation, but through alignment with a level of consciousness that recognizes abundance as the natural state of all creation. And he felt a deep gratitude, not just for the money, but for the restoration of his faith in the goodness and provision of the divine source. When Reverend Johnston contacted Florence to tell her what had happened, she was not surprised, but rather smiled with the knowing of someone who has seen this law in operation many times, and she explained that the money had not been created by his declaration, but had been released from the invisible realm where all good things already exist in perfect form, waiting for someone to claim them through the recognition of their divine inheritance. And she told him that this was only the beginning, and that as he continued to live from the consciousness of the inner temple, his congregation would continue to experience greater and greater demonstrations of divine supply. This principle that Florence taught about, the inner temple, is not a metaphor or a visualization technique, but a description of an actual spiritual reality that exists beyond the perception of the physical senses. And modern quantum physics has begun to confirm what Florence understood intuitively over 100 years ago, which is that consciousness is the fundamental substrate of all reality, and that what we call physical matter is simply consciousness expressing itself in temporary forms. And when we learn to access the level of consciousness that Florence called the inner temple, we tap into the creative power that is constantly bringing all manifestation into being. The reason this principle works so powerfully during sleep is that when we sleep, the ego mind with all its fears and limitations steps aside, and the soul mind awakens. And the soul mind already knows the way to the inner temple, because the soul has never actually left the temple, but has only been distracted by the drama and appearances of the physical world. And when we set a clear intention before sleep to enter the inner temple and receive divine supply, we give the soul permission to do what it knows how to do naturally, which is to align our consciousness with the infinite abundance that is our birthright as children of the divine source. As you continue resting now, your soul is already beginning to remember its way to the inner temple, and you do not need to create this temple or build it or earn entrance to it, because it has always existed within. You waiting for your return. And even if your mind does not understand how this is possible, your heart recognizes the truth of what I am sharing, and your heart is already opening to receive what has always been yours, and what will continue to flow to you as naturally as breath flows through your body, and as the sun rises each morning without effort or strain. What I want you to understand now, as you rest in this peaceful state, is that the inner temple is not merely a beautiful metaphor or a helpful visualization, but an actual spiritual location that exists in the dimension of consciousness that underlies all physical reality. And Florence Scovel Shinn discovered through years of careful observation and documentation that when people learn to access this temple, especially during the vulnerable and receptive state of sleep, their external circumstances would begin to reorganize themselves to match the perfect pattern of abundance that exists eternally within the temple of their divine consciousness. The architecture of this inner temple is built not from stone or wood, but from spiritual substance, which is consciousness itself in its pure creative form, and every pillar and every wall and every chamber within this temple is constructed from divine ideas that have never known limitation or lack. And when you enter this temple through the gateway of sleep, you step into a realm where the laws that govern physical reality are transcended by the higher laws that govern spiritual reality. And in this realm, effect precedes cause, and desire is simultaneous with fulfillment, because there is no time delay between recognition and manifestation. Florence described this temple as having golden walls that radiate with the light of infinite possibility, and chambers filled with treasures that represent every form of good that could ever be needed or desired. And she taught that when we enter this temple in consciousness, we do not go there to ask for things or to beg for provision, but rather to recognize and claim what is already ours by divine inheritance. And she said that the act of entering the temple is itself a statement of faith, that we belong there, and that everything within the temple belongs to us, because we are children of the infinite source that created all abundance. Let me tell you about Clarence Henderson, who was 71 years old when he first learned about the inner temple, and Clarence lived alone in a small apartment in Richmond, Virginia, after his wife of 48 years had passed away from cancer 3 years earlier, and Clarence had been a high school mathematics teacher for 37 years until he retired at age 65 with what he thought was an adequate pension. But inflation and medical expenses had eaten away at his savings, and his monthly pension check of $1,123 was barely enough to cover his rent and basic expenses, and certainly not enough to maintain the dignity and independence he had always valued. Clarence had always been a proud man who preferred to solve his own problems rather than ask for help, and he had not told his adult children about his financial struggles because he did not want them to worry or feel obligated to support him when they had their own families and mortgages to manage, and he spent most of his days reading library books and taking long walks through the neighborhood to pass the time and to avoid sitting in his apartment thinking about his dwindling bank account and uncertain future. It was on a Tuesday evening in September, when Clarence was walking past the community center, that he noticed a sign advertising a free lecture on practical spirituality, and something made him stop and read the details, even though he had never been particularly interested in spiritual teachings and had attended church only sporadically throughout his life. And the lecture was scheduled for 7:30 that evening, and since he had nothing else planned, Clarence decided to attend more out of curiosity than any real expectation that he would learn anything useful. The speaker was an elderly woman named Dr. Margaret Foster, who had been studying and teaching Florence Scovel Shinn's principles for over 40 years, and she began her lecture by asking the audience to imagine that they lived in a magnificent palace but had forgotten this fact and were spending their days sitting outside the palace gates, begging for scraps from passers-by, when they could simply walk through the front door and claim their rightful place at the royal table. And she explained that this was exactly the situation of most human beings who have forgotten their divine inheritance and spend their lives struggling for provision that is already theirs by spiritual birthright. Dr. Foster spoke about the inner temple teaching with such conviction and authority that something inside Clarence began to awaken and pay attention, and she explained that within each person's consciousness there exists a perfect pattern of abundance and fulfillment that has never been touched by the limitations and struggles of their physical experience. And she said that this pattern exists in what Florence Scovel Shinn called the inner temple, and that access to this temple is available to anyone who learns to align their consciousness with this deeper reality, especially during the powerful and receptive time of sleep. When Dr. Foster described the practice of entering the inner temple before sleep, Clarence felt a stirring of hope that he had not felt in many months, and she taught the group to say before sleep, "I enter my inner temple now, and I claim my divine inheritance of perfect provision." And she explained that this was not a request or a prayer, but a recognition of what is already true in the spiritual dimension of their being. And she said that when spoken with faith and understanding, these words would activate the law of spiritual correspondence that would begin to attract matching circumstances in the physical world. That night, when Clarence returned to his apartment, he felt more peaceful and hopeful than he had felt since his wife's death. And as he prepared for bed, he remembered Dr. Foster's words about the inner temple, and although he felt somewhat foolish talking to an empty room, he decided to try the practice she had taught, and he said aloud, "I enter my inner temple now, and I claim my divine inheritance of perfect provision." And as he spoke these words, he felt something shift inside his chest, as if a door that had been closed for a long time was beginning to open. As Clarence lay in bed that night, he found his mind drifting into a state that was between waking and sleeping. And in this state, he began to see images of a beautiful temple with golden walls and floors made of some kind of luminous stone that seemed to glow with its own inner light. And he saw himself walking through the chambers of this temple, and each chamber was filled with treasures and provisions of every kind, and he felt a deep sense of belonging and recognition, as if he had finally come home after a long journey in a foreign land. Clarence slept more peacefully that night than he had in months, and he woke the next morning with an unusual sense of expectancy and calm, as if something good was about to happen. But he tried not to get his hopes up, because he had been disappointed too many times in recent years, and he went about his normal routine of coffee and toast and reading the newspaper. But throughout the day, he found himself thinking about the inner temple and feeling a quiet confidence that he could not quite explain. On Wednesday evening, Clarence again practiced entering the inner temple before sleep, and this time the images were even clearer, and he could see himself sitting at a magnificent table, laden with an abundance of food and surrounded by beautiful objects and works of art, and he felt completely at peace and provided for, and he knew with a certainty that went beyond logical thinking that this vision represented his true spiritual reality, and that somehow this inner reality would begin to manifest in his outer experience. On Thursday morning, Clarence received a phone call from a man named Robert Wilson, who introduced himself as a representative of the Richmond Public School District and explained that they were looking for retired teachers who would be willing to work part-time as tutors for students who were struggling with mathematics, and the position would pay $22 per hour for 15 hours per week, which would add an additional $330 to Clarence's monthly income. And Mr. Wilson said that Clarence had been recommended by his former principal, who remembered his exceptional ability to explain complex concepts in simple terms. Clarence was surprised and pleased by this unexpected opportunity, and he agreed to meet with Mr. Wilson the following Monday to discuss the details. And when he hung up the phone, he immediately thought of the inner temple teaching and realized that this job offer had appeared just 3 days after he had begun the practice of claiming his divine inheritance, and he felt a deep gratitude and wonder at how quickly the spiritual law had begun to operate in his life. But the manifestations were only beginning, and on Friday afternoon, while Clarence was checking his mail, he found an envelope from the Richmond Community College Continuing Education Department, and inside was a letter inviting him to teach a basic mathematics course for adult learners who were preparing for their GED exams. and the letter explained that they had received his name from the school district and wondered if he would be interested in teaching 2 evening classes per week for $400 per month. And Clarence read the letter twice because he could hardly believe that 2 teaching opportunities had presented themselves in the same week. After 3 years of retirement, Clarence called the community college and scheduled an interview for the following Tuesday. And as he sat in his apartment that evening, reflecting on the events of the week, he realized that his monthly income was about to increase from $1,123 to over $1,800, which would be more than enough to live comfortably and to restore the sense of security and dignity that he had been missing. And he understood that this transformation had not happened through his own efforts or networking, but through the mysterious operation of spiritual law that he was only beginning to comprehend. That night, when Clarence entered his inner temple in consciousness, he felt a profound sense of gratitude and recognition, and he understood that the temple had always been there waiting for him, and that all the provision he needed had always been available, but he had not known how to access it. Because no one had ever taught him that he was a spiritual being with the divine right to claim his inheritance of abundance. And he realized that his years of struggle and worry had been unnecessary, because he had been trying to solve a spiritual problem with material solutions, when what he needed was to align his consciousness with the spiritual reality of infinite provision. Within 2 weeks, Clarence had begun both teaching positions, and he discovered that he loved working with adult students who were motivated to learn and appreciated his patient teaching style. And he found that the extra income allowed him to not only meet his basic needs, but to enjoy some of the small luxuries that he had given up during his years of financial stress. And he was able to buy books and take occasional trips to visit his children and grandchildren, and he felt a renewed sense of purpose and vitality that made him look forward to each day. The principle that operated in Clarence's life is the same principle that Florence Scovel Shinn taught throughout her career, which is that consciousness is the true cause of all circumstances. And when we learn to dwell in the consciousness of the inner temple, where abundance is the natural state, we begin to attract experiences that match this elevated awareness. And the reason this works so powerfully during sleep is that sleep is a time when the ego mind, with all its fears and limitations, steps aside and allows the soul mind to access the deeper levels of reality, where all good things already exist in perfect form. As you continue to rest now, your own consciousness is being gently shifted toward the frequency of the inner temple. And you do not need to make this happen through effort or concentration, but simply through the relaxed allowing that comes naturally when you surrender to the wisdom of your deeper self and trust that the same infinite intelligence that brings the sunrise each morning and causes flowers to bloom in their perfect timing is also orchestrating the perfect provision for your life in ways that your logical mind cannot foresee, but your heart can feel and recognize as absolutely true. The most transformative understanding that Florence Scovel Shinn brought to spiritual teaching was her recognition that manifestation is not about attracting what you want, but about expressing who you are. And she taught that every person has 2 possible identities they can live from, which are the identity of the seeker who lives outside, the temple begging for provision, and the identity of the temple dweller who lives inside the temple, recognizing abundance as their natural inheritance. And she discovered that when people learned to shift their fundamental identity from seeker to temple dweller, their entire life experience would reorganize itself around this new self-concept with remarkable speed and permanence. The identity of the seeker is based on the belief that you are separate from the source of your good and that you must somehow earn or deserve or work hard enough to receive what you need, and this identity creates a consciousness of lack and limitation that attracts experiences of struggle and insufficiency, because the universe always mirrors back to us the truth of what we believe ourselves to be. And when we identify as someone who lacks something, the universe has no choice but to provide us with experiences that confirm this self-concept, and the seeker lives in a constant state of anxiety and effort, trying to manipulate circumstances and control outcomes through force and willpower. The identity of the temple dweller is based on the recognition that you are one with the infinite source of all good, and that abundance is not something you receive from outside yourself, but something you express from within yourself. And when you truly understand that you live permanently in the inner temple of divine consciousness, you stop seeking and start claiming, and you stop asking and start declaring, and you stop hoping and start knowing, because a temple dweller does not hope for abundance anymore than a fish hopes for water or a bird hopes for air, because abundance is the natural environment in which the temple dweller exists. Florence taught that the shift from seeker identity to temple dweller identity usually happens gradually as a person begins to practice the principles and see evidence of their effectiveness. But sometimes this shift can happen instantaneously in a moment of profound recognition. And she said that the moment a person truly realizes that they have never actually been outside the temple, but have only forgotten their true residence, everything in their life begins to change because they stop operating from the consciousness of lack and begin operating from the consciousness of fullness. Let me tell you about Evelyn Margaret Sullivan, who was 59 years old when she experienced this profound shift in identity. And Evelyn lived in a small house in Columbus, Ohio, that she had inherited from her parents 5 years earlier when they both died within 6 months of each other, and Evelyn had never married and had worked as a secretary at an insurance company for 38 years until she was laid off 2 years before her retirement due to company downsizing. And although she received a small severance package and unemployment benefits, her financial situation was precarious, and she was deeply worried about how she would support herself for the rest of her life. Evelyn had always been a worrier by nature, and after losing her job, her anxiety became so intense that she would lie awake most nights thinking about worst-case scenarios and imagining herself homeless or unable to afford medical care. And her constant worry and fear began to affect her physical health, and she developed digestive problems and headaches, and her doctor suggested that stress was the underlying cause. But knowing this did not help her stop worrying because her fears felt completely justified. Given her circumstances, the worst part for Evelyn was not the financial uncertainty itself, but the way her anxiety was affecting her relationships with her adult children and her few close friends, because she found herself constantly talking about her problems and asking for advice and reassurance, and she could see that people were beginning to avoid her because her energy had become so heavy and negative, and this made her feel even more alone and frightened, and she began to spiral into a depression that made everything seem hopeless and overwhelming. Evelyn's sister Patricia, who lived in Denver, had been encouraging her to attend a spiritual study group that met weekly at a local Unity church, and Patricia had been studying metaphysical principles for several years and had experienced significant improvements in her own life through applying these teachings. But Evelyn had always been skeptical of what she considered New Age nonsense and preferred to rely on practical solutions, rather than spiritual theories that seemed too good to be true and too far removed from the harsh realities of everyday survival. It was on a cold Thursday evening in November, when Evelyn was feeling particularly discouraged and lonely, that she finally decided to attend one of the study group meetings more to please her sister than because she expected to find anything helpful. And the group was studying the teachings of Florence Scovel Shinn. And that week, they were discussing the concept of identity transformation and how changing your fundamental self-concept could change your entire life experience. And the group leader was a woman named Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who had been teaching these principles for over 20 years. Dr. Mitchell began the session by asking each person to introduce themselves and to share whether they saw themselves as someone who was trying to get their needs met, or someone whose needs were naturally and constantly being met. And when it was Evelyn's turn, she said, "My name is Evelyn, and I am definitely someone who is trying to get my needs met because I lost my job and I worry about money all the time, and I feel like I am always struggling just to keep my head above water." And Dr. Mitchell nodded with compassion and said that this was exactly the kind of honest self-assessment that makes transformation possible. Dr. Mitchell then explained that according to Florence Scovel Shinn, every person lives from one of two fundamental identities, which she called the identity of lack and the identity of abundance. And she said that the identity of lack is based on the belief that you are separate from the source of your good and must work hard and worry constantly to try to secure what you need. And the identity of abundance is based on the recognition that you are permanently connected to an infinite source of supply, and that provision is your natural inheritance rather than something you must earn or deserve. She went on to explain that when Florence worked with people, she never tried to change their circumstances directly, but instead helped them to recognize their true spiritual identity as children of infinite abundance. And she said that when people truly understood that they lived permanently in what she called the inner temple of divine supply, their external circumstances would automatically reorganize themselves to match this elevated self-concept. Because the universe always mirrors back to us the truth of what we believe ourselves to be. Dr. Mitchell then taught the group a practice that Florence had used with hundreds of her students, and she said that every night before sleep, they should declare their true identity by saying, "I am a temple dweller, and I live permanently in the realm of divine abundance, and every need is met before it arises, because I am one with the infinite source that provides for all creation." And she explained that this was not positive thinking or wishful thinking, but a recognition of spiritual truth that would activate the law of correspondence and begin to attract matching experiences. That night, when Evelyn returned to her small house, she felt more hopeful than she had in months. And although she still felt somewhat skeptical about the whole concept, she decided to try the practice because she had nothing to lose and everything to gain. And as she prepared for bed, she said the words that Dr. Mitchell had taught her, "I am a temple dweller, and I live permanently in the realm of divine abundance, and every need is met before it arises, because I am one with the infinite source that provides for all creation." As Evelyn spoke these words, something extraordinary happened, and she felt a sudden shift in her consciousness, as if she had been looking at her life through a dirty window, and someone had suddenly cleaned the glass, and she could see clearly for the first time in years. And in that moment she realized that she had been living from a completely false identity based on fear and limitation, when her true identity was as a beloved child of the universe who was permanently provided for and cared for by an intelligence that was infinitely wise and loving and abundant. The shift was so profound and immediate that Evelyn began to cry, but these were tears of relief and recognition rather than tears of despair, and she felt as if she had been carrying a heavy burden for years and had suddenly been told that she could set it down, and she understood that her struggle and worry had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding about who she was and what was possible for her life, and she realized that she had been living outside the temple of her own divine nature when she had always had the right to live inside, where everything she needed was already provided. Over the following days and weeks, Evelyn noticed that her entire approach to life began to change, and instead of waking up each morning with anxiety about how she would solve her problems, she woke up with a quiet confidence that solutions were already being prepared, and instead of constantly talking about her fears and worries, she found herself speaking with gratitude about the good things in her life and focusing on possibilities rather than problems. And people began to comment that she seemed different, somehow lighter and more peaceful and more pleasant to be around. Within 2 weeks of beginning the temple dweller practice, Evelyn received a call from her former supervisor at the insurance company, who said that they had received several requests from clients who specifically wanted to work with Evelyn, and they wondered if she would be willing to work as an independent contractor providing customer service support for her old accounts, and the pay would be $26 per hour for approximately 20 hours per week, which would provide her with a steady income while allowing her the flexibility to explore other opportunities. Evelyn was amazed that this opportunity had appeared so quickly and in such an unexpected way, and she realized that the clients who were requesting her services were people she had served with particular care and attention during her years at the company, and they had remembered her kindness and competence and specifically asked for her when they learned she was no longer with the company, and she understood that the goodwill she had built up over the years was now coming back to her in the form of financial provision exactly when she needed it most. But even more significant than the job opportunity was the change in Evelyn's relationship with her children and friends, and she found that when she stopped constantly talking about her problems and started expressing gratitude for her blessings, people enjoyed being around her again, and her adult children began calling more frequently and inviting her to family gatherings, and her friends started reaching out to make plans, and she realized that her shift in identity had not only affected her financial situation, but had transformed all of her relationships by changing the energy she brought to every interaction. The principle that worked in Evelyn's life is the same principle that Florence Scovel Shinn taught throughout her career, which is that identity is destiny, and when you truly recognize yourself as a temple dweller rather than a seeker, your entire life reorganizes itself around this elevated self-concept, and you begin to attract experiences that match your recognition of abundance rather than your fear of lack. And this transformation happens not because you have changed your circumstances, but because you have remembered who you truly are beneath all the false beliefs and limitations that were never really true. Florence taught that this shift in identity is particularly powerful when it happens during the transition into sleep, because sleep is a time when the ego mind relaxes its grip on familiar patterns and the soul mind is free to access deeper levels of truth. And when you declare your identity as a temple dweller in that liminal space between waking and sleeping, you plant seeds of transformation in the fertile soil of the subconscious mind, where they can grow and flourish without interference from doubt or fear or old conditioning. The 3 levels of temple dweller identity that Florence identified are: first, the recognition that you belong in the temple and have the right to be there, which overcomes the false humility that keeps many people living in lack because they do not believe they deserve abundance. And second, the understanding that the temple is your permanent residence rather than a place you visit occasionally, which means that abundance is your natural state rather than something you experience only during good times. And third, the knowing that as a temple dweller, you are not just a recipient of divine supply, but a channel through which infinite abundance flows to bless others and serve the highest good. As you continue to rest now in this peaceful and receptive state, your own identity is quietly shifting from seeker to temple dweller, and you do not need to force this transformation or figure out how it works, but simply allow it to happen naturally as your deeper self recognizes the truth of what you are hearing and begins to align your consciousness with the reality of your divine inheritance. And when you wake tomorrow, you will find that something fundamental has changed in your relationship to provision and abundance, and you will know yourself as someone who lives permanently in the temple of divine supply, where every need is always met before it arises. Now, I must tell you honestly that even when people hear about the inner temple and feel the truth of this teaching resonating in their hearts, there is often a part of the mind that immediately begins to resist and argue and create obstacles, and Florence Scovel Shinn understood this resistance very well because she observed it in almost every person she worked with, and she discovered that this resistance is not a sign that the teaching is wrong or that the person is not ready, but rather a natural response of the ego mind, which has been programmed to believe in limitation and scarcity, and feels threatened when these fundamental beliefs are challenged by a larger truth. The ego mind has invested tremendous energy in maintaining the story that you are separate from your good, and that life is difficult, and resources are scarce, and you must work hard and worry constantly to survive. And when you begin to recognize your true identity as a temple dweller who has permanent access to infinite supply, the ego mind perceives this as a death threat, because if you no longer believe in lack and limitation, then the ego mind loses its primary function, which is to protect you from dangers that are largely imaginary and based on false beliefs about the nature of reality. Florence identified 7 primary forms of resistance that people encounter when they begin to live from temple consciousness. And she taught that these resistances are not enemies to be fought, but teachers to be understood. And when you can recognize these patterns of resistance without judgment and respond to them with compassion and wisdom, they lose their power to keep you trapped in the consciousness of lack, and instead become stepping stones that lead you deeper into the truth of your divine inheritance. The first resistance is the voice that says this is too good to be true, and there must be a catch somewhere because nothing in life is free. And if abundance were really available to everyone, then why are so many people struggling? And this voice comes from the part of the mind that has been conditioned by a world that operates from scarcity consciousness and has forgotten that the spiritual laws that govern true prosperity are different from the economic laws that govern material exchange. And Florence taught that this resistance is overcome by understanding that divine supply is not limited by human concepts of fairness or economics, but operates according to higher principles of love and grace. The second resistance is the voice that says, I do not deserve abundance because I have made mistakes, or I am not good enough or spiritual enough, or I have not earned the right to live in the temple. And this voice comes from false guilt and unworthiness that have been programmed by religious and social conditioning that teaches people to believe they are sinners or failures rather than beloved children of an infinitely loving Creator. And Florence taught that this resistance is overcome by recognizing that divine supply is not based on personal merit, but on spiritual inheritance. And just as every child deserves to be fed and clothed and loved by their parents, every soul deserves to receive abundant provision from the infinite source that created them. The third resistance is the voice that says it would be selfish to want abundance when so many people are suffering, and I should be satisfied with less so that others can have more. And this voice comes from a misunderstanding about the nature of abundance, which assumes that there is a limited supply that must be rationed rather than an infinite source that becomes more available as more people learn to access it. And Florence taught that this resistance is overcome by understanding that when you live from temple consciousness, you become a channel through which abundance flows not only to you, but through you, to bless others, and your prosperity serves the collective good rather than depriving anyone else. The fourth resistance is the voice that says, spiritual people should not be concerned with material things, and wanting abundance shows that I am not evolved enough to transcend worldly desires. And this voice comes from the false belief that spirituality requires poverty, or that there is something noble about suffering and lack. And Florence taught that this resistance is overcome by recognizing that the same divine intelligence that created the beauty of flowers and sunsets and music also wants to express itself through material abundance, and that rejecting prosperity is actually a rejection of the goodness of creation itself. The fifth resistance is the voice that says, if I become abundant, people will judge me or expect things from me or think that I am greedy or materialistic, and I will lose the sympathy and support that comes from being seen as someone who struggles. And this voice comes from the fear of social rejection and the comfort that can be found in sharing a common identity with others who also struggle financially. And Florence taught that this resistance is overcome by understanding that true abundance includes the wisdom to handle prosperity with grace and the confidence to live authentically regardless of what others might think or say. The sixth resistance is the voice that says, I have tried manifestation techniques before, and they did not work for me, so this will probably not work either, and I am just setting myself up for disappointment. And this voice comes from past experiences where people may have tried to use spiritual principles as manipulation techniques rather than understanding them as natural laws that require a genuine shift in consciousness. And Florence taught that this resistance is overcome by recognizing that previous failures were not failures of the principles, but failures to understand how consciousness creates reality. The seventh resistance is the voice that says, even if this works for me, it is probably temporary, and something bad will happen to take it away, because good things never last in my life. And this voice comes from a deep fear of loss that prevents people from fully receiving and enjoying their good. And Florence taught that this resistance is overcome by understanding that divine supply is not subject to the fluctuations and uncertainties of the material world, but comes from an inexhaustible source that never runs dry and can never be depleted. Let me tell you about Josephine Marie Thompson, who was 65 years old when she encountered every one of these resistances during her first week of practicing the inner temple teaching. And Josephine lived in a small apartment in Nashville, Tennessee, where she had moved after her divorce 15 years earlier, when she needed to start over with very little money and no clear plan for her future. And she had worked various part-time jobs over the years, but had never been able to achieve the financial security she had hoped for. And she was facing retirement with only her small Social Security benefit and a savings account that contained less than $3,000. Josephine had heard about Florence Scovel Shinn's teachings from her neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, who had been studying metaphysical principles for many years and had experienced several remarkable demonstrations of supply, and Mrs. Henderson had loaned Josephine a collection of Florence's writings and encouraged her to try the inner temple practice for at least 1 week to see what might happen. And although Josephine was initially skeptical, she was also desperate enough to try anything that might improve her situation. On Sunday night, Josephine read about the inner temple teaching and decided to begin the practice that evening. And as she prepared for bed, she said the words, "I enter my inner temple now, and I claim my divine inheritance of infinite abundance." And as she spoke these words, she felt a flutter of excitement and hope in her chest, as if something long dormant was beginning to awaken, and she fell asleep with a sense of peaceful expectancy that she had not felt in many years. But on Monday morning, as Josephine was drinking her coffee and thinking about the practice she had begun the previous night, the first resistance voice appeared in her mind, and it said, "This is ridiculous, and there is no such thing as magic or miracles, and if there were some secret temple of abundance, then surely someone would have discovered it by now and proved it scientifically. And you are just engaging in wishful thinking because you are afraid to face the reality that you are going to be poor for the rest of your life." And Josephine felt her hope beginning to deflate as this voice became louder and more insistent throughout the day. On Monday night, Josephine almost skipped the temple practice because the resistance voice had been so convincing, but she remembered her promise to Mrs. Henderson to try for a full week, and she said the words again, although with less enthusiasm than the night before. And she noticed that the sense of peace and expectancy was much weaker, and she began to wonder if she had imagined the positive feelings from the previous evening and if she was just deluding herself with fantasies about abundance and prosperity. On Tuesday, the second resistance voice appeared, and it said, "Even if this temple thing were real, you do not deserve to live in abundance. Because you have made so many mistakes in your life, and you chose the wrong husband and the wrong career, and you have never been particularly successful at anything. And God probably thinks you should learn to be grateful for what little you have, rather than asking for more." And Josephine spent most of Tuesday feeling guilty and unworthy, and she found herself making a mental list of all her failures and shortcomings as evidence that she did not deserve prosperity. On Wednesday, the third resistance voice said it would be selfish to want abundance when there are homeless people and hungry children in the world. And you should be ashamed of yourself for focusing on your own comfort when so many people are truly suffering. And if you were a good person, you would volunteer at a soup kitchen instead of lying in bed dreaming about having more money. And Josephine felt conflicted because she did care about social justice, and she wondered if wanting prosperity made her shallow and materialistic. Thursday, the fourth resistance voice said, "Spiritual people are supposed to live simply and transcend attachment to material things. And wanting abundance shows that you are not evolved enough to understand that happiness comes from within and not from external circumstances. And if you were truly enlightened, you would be content with poverty because you would know that your worth is not determined by how much money you have." And Josephine began to feel ashamed of her desire for financial security and wondered if this made her spiritually inferior. On Friday the 5th, Resistance Voice said, "If you became wealthy, people would expect you to share your money, and they would judge you if you spent it on yourself, and your friends would resent your success and think you had gotten too big for your britches, and you would lose the connections you have with people who understand what it is like to struggle financially, and you would become isolated and lonely in your abundance." And Josephine realized That part of her actually felt comfortable with her financial struggles because they gave her something in common with most of the people she knew. On Saturday, the sixth resistance voice said, "You have tried positive thinking and affirmations before, and they never worked. So why would this be any different? And you are probably just setting yourself up for another disappointment, and it would be better to accept your limitations and stop believing in fairy tales about manifestation and abundance. Because the only thing that really works is hard work and saving money and being practical about what is possible." And Josephine felt discouraged and wondered if she should give up the temple practice and focus on finding another part-time job instead. On Sunday morning, the seventh resistance voice said, "Even if this did work, it would probably be temporary, and something would happen to take the money away, because good things never last for people like you, and you would just end up losing everything. Again, like you did when you got divorced, and you would be even worse off than you are now, because you would have gotten your hopes up only to have them crushed again, and it would be safer to just accept being poor than to risk that kind of disappointment." By Sunday evening, Josephine was feeling completely overwhelmed by the week of mental resistance, and she was ready to give up the temple practice and dismiss the whole thing as New Age nonsense that might work for other people, but was clearly not meant for someone like her. And she was sitting in her small living room feeling defeated and discouraged when she remembered something that Mrs. Henderson had told her about Florence Scovel Shinn's teaching, that resistance is not a sign that the principles are wrong, but a sign that they are working, and that the ego mind always fights against transformation because it feels threatened by the possibility of change. Josephine realized that the fact that she had encountered so much resistance during the week might actually mean that something important was trying to shift in her consciousness, and she decided to try the temple practice one more time. But this time, instead of fighting against the resistance voices, she would simply acknowledge them and then choose to focus on the truth that Florence taught about divine inheritance and spiritual abundance. And she said aloud, "I recognize that my ego mind is afraid of change, but I choose to trust in my divine inheritance of infinite abundance, and I enter my inner temple now." As Josephine spoke these words with renewed determination, she felt the resistance voices begin to quiet, and she experienced a deep sense of peace and surrender, as if she was finally allowing herself to receive something that had been waiting for her all along. And she slept more peacefully that night than she had all week. And she woke Monday morning with a clear sense that something had shifted during the night, and that she was no longer the same person who had begun this practice a week earlier. On Monday afternoon, Josephine received a phone call from a woman named Mrs. Patterson, who explained that she was calling on behalf of her elderly mother who lived in an assisted living facility and needed someone to help her organize and sort through a lifetime collection of photographs and documents. And Mrs. Patterson said that the facility director had recommended Josephine because she had a reputation for being patient and gentle with elderly people, and the job would pay $15 per hour for approximately 12 hours per week and could continue for several months. Josephine was surprised and pleased by this unexpected opportunity, and she realized that the work would be perfect for her because she enjoyed listening to older people's stories and helping them preserve their memories, and the additional income would make a significant difference in her monthly budget. And she felt a deep gratitude that this opportunity had appeared just as she was completing her week of temple practice and learning to recognize and overcome the voices of resistance that had been keeping her trapped in limitation. As you continue resting now, your own mind may be generating various forms of resistance to the truth. I am sharing about the inner temple and divine supply, and this is completely natural and normal, and does not mean that you are not ready to receive abundance, but simply that your ego mind is trying to protect you from change, even when that change would be for your highest good. And you can acknowledge these resistance voices with compassion while choosing to align your deeper self with the truth of your divine inheritance that has never been touched by doubt or fear or limitation. One of the most beautiful aspects of Florence Scovel Shinn's teaching about the inner temple is her understanding that when you begin to align your consciousness with the reality of divine supply, the universe immediately begins to send you confirmation signals that let you know you are on the right path. And these signals are not coincidences or accidents, but are the natural result of your consciousness beginning to vibrate at the frequency of abundance and attracting experiences that match this elevated state of awareness. And Florence taught that learning to recognize and interpret these signs is an essential skill for anyone who wants to live permanently in the consciousness of the temple dweller. The language of signs that the universe speaks is not the language of words, but the language of symbols and synchronicities and meaningful coincidences that bypass the logical mind and speak directly to the intuitive heart. And Florence discovered that when people began to practice entering the inner temple during sleep, they would almost always begin to notice small but significant signs. Within the first few days, that confirmed their consciousness was shifting toward a greater receptivity to divine supply, and she taught her students to pay attention to these signs and to receive them with gratitude, because gratitude amplifies the signal and attracts even more powerful confirmations. Florence identified 3 distinct levels of signs that people typically experience as they deepen their practice of temple consciousness, and she taught that these signs usually appear in a progressive sequence, starting with very subtle internal shifts and gradually building toward more obvious external manifestations. And she said that understanding this progression helps people maintain their faith and confidence during the early stages, when the signs might be so subtle that the logical mind could easily dismiss them as imagination or wishful thinking. The first level of signs consists of internal changes in feeling and perception that indicate your consciousness is beginning to align with the frequency of the inner temple. And these might include a sense of peace and calm about financial matters that previously caused anxiety, or a feeling of excitement and anticipation about your future that replaces the worry and dread you used to feel, or a sudden knowing that everything is going to work out, even though you cannot see how this could be possible given your current circumstances. And Florence taught that these internal shifts are actually the most important signs, because they indicate that the foundation of transformation is being established in consciousness, where all change must begin. The second level of signs consists of small external synchronicities and coincidences that seem to relate to your needs and desires, but are not yet direct manifestations of supply. And these might include finding coins on the ground, or seeing repeating numbers, or having conversations with strangers that contain exactly the encouragement or information you need to hear, or discovering resources and opportunities that you did not know existed. And Florence taught that these signs are like love letters from the universe, letting you know that your prayers and declarations are being received and that divine intelligence is working behind the scenes to orchestrate your good. The third level of signs consists of actual manifestations of supply and abundance that directly address your specific needs and desires. And these manifestations often come through channels that you never could have anticipated or planned, and they usually arrive with perfect timing just when you need them most. And Florence taught that when people reach this level of demonstration, they often feel amazed and grateful, but they should not be surprised, because manifestation is simply the natural result of consciousness that has been consistently aligned with the truth of divine abundance. Let me tell you about Randolph James Morrison, who was 63 years old when he began to experience this progression of signs after learning about the inner temple teaching. And Randolph lived in a small house in Portland, Maine, that he had purchased 28 years earlier when he was working as a mechanic at a local auto repair shop. And he had retired 3 years earlier due to arthritis in his hands that made it difficult for him to perform the detailed work that his job required. And his retirement income from Social Security and a small pension was adequate to cover his basic expenses, but left very little margin for unexpected costs or small luxuries. Randolph had always been a practical man who believed in hard work and self-reliance, and he was naturally skeptical of anything that sounded like get-rich-quick schemes or unrealistic promises about easy money. But he had been experiencing some health problems that were causing him concern, and his doctor had recommended some treatments that were not fully covered by his insurance, and he was worried about how he would pay for these treatments without going into debt or depleting his small savings account. It was Randolph's sister-in-law, Carol, who who first told him about Florence Scovel Shinn's teachings when she visited from Boston in late October, and noticed that Randolph seemed stressed and anxious about his financial situation. And Carol had been studying metaphysical principles for several years and had seen significant improvements in her own life through applying these teachings, and she spent an entire afternoon explaining to Randolph about consciousness and manifestation and the inner temple practice that had been so helpful to her. Randolph listened politely to Carol's explanations, but he remained skeptical until she told him about her own experience of manifesting an unexpected windfall of $8,300 that had allowed her to pay off her credit card debt and take a vacation to Europe that she had been dreaming about for years, and the money had come through a completely unexpected source when an old life insurance policy that she had forgotten about matured, and she received a check in the mail just 2 weeks after she had begun practicing the inner temple teaching. Carol encouraged Randolph to try the practice for at least 2 weeks, and she explained that he had nothing to lose and everything to gain, and she taught him to say before sleep each night, "I enter my inner temple now, and I gratefully receive the divine supply that flows to me through perfect channels, in perfect timing." And she told him that Florence Scovel Shinn had always emphasized the importance of gratitude and perfect timing, because trying to force outcomes or control the how and when of manifestation actually blocks the flow of good rather than enhancing it. That first night, Randolph felt somewhat foolish talking to an empty bedroom, but he decided to honor his promise to Carol, and he said the words she had taught him. And as he spoke them, he was surprised to feel a subtle shift in his chest, as if something tight was beginning to loosen, and he slept well that night, without the usual worry about his medical expenses keeping him awake, and he woke the next morning feeling more peaceful and optimistic than he had felt in several weeks. On Tuesday morning, Randolph was having his usual breakfast of coffee and toast while reading the local newspaper when he noticed a small article about a man who had found a rare coin in his garden that turned out to be worth several $1,000s. And normally Randolph would have skimmed past this type of human interest story, but for some reason, he found himself reading every word and thinking about how unexpected good fortune can appear in the most ordinary circumstances. And he felt a flutter of excitement, as if this story was somehow significant for his own life. Later that same day, while Randolph was walking to the post office, he glanced down at the sidewalk and saw a shiny penny lying heads up near the entrance, and he remembered hearing somewhere that finding a penny heads up was considered good luck, and although he usually would not have bothered to pick up a penny, he found himself bending down to retrieve it, and as he held the coin in his palm, he felt a strange sense of significance, as if this small discovery was connected to something larger and more meaningful. On Wednesday morning, Randolph found another penny heads up in the parking lot of the grocery store, and this time he immediately thought of the inner temple practice and wondered if these coins might be the kind of signs that Carol had mentioned. And he picked up the second penny with a growing sense of excitement and anticipation, and he decided to keep both coins in a small dish on his kitchen counter as reminders that good things were beginning to flow into his life in small but noticeable ways. That same Wednesday afternoon, Randolph received a phone call from his insurance company informing him that they had reviewed his claim for the medical treatments his doctor had recommended, and they had decided to approve coverage for a larger portion of the costs than they had originally indicated. And the representative explained that a new policy had gone into effect that provided better coverage for his particular condition, and his out-of-pocket expenses would be reduced by approximately $700. Randolph was pleasantly surprised by this news because he had been told that insurance rarely changes their initial coverage decisions. And he immediately thought of the inner temple practice and wondered if this improved coverage might be related to his nightly declarations about divine supply flowing through perfect channels. And he felt a growing confidence that something beneficial was indeed happening in his life, even though he could not explain how or why. On Thursday, Randolph found a $5 bill folded neatly on the ground near his mailbox. And this discovery felt so obviously connected to the pennies and the insurance. News that he could no longer dismiss these events as mere coincidences, and he began to feel genuinely excited about what might happen next, and he found himself looking forward to his evening temple practice with the eager anticipation of someone who has begun to see evidence that their prayers are being answered. On Friday morning, Randolph was checking his mail when he found an envelope addressed to him from a company he did not recognize, and when he opened it, he discovered a rebate check for $163 for a home appliance he had purchased over a year earlier, and he had completely forgotten about submitting the rebate form and had assumed that too much time had passed for the rebate to be honored. But apparently, the company had found his paperwork and processed the refund with interest. Randolph stood in his kitchen holding the rebate check and marveling at how these small manifestations seemed to be building momentum, and he realized that in just 5 days he had found a total of $5.07 in cash and had received unexpected insurance coverage worth $700 and a rebate check for $163. And he calculated that the total value of these unexpected benefits was $868.07, which was almost exactly the amount he had been worried about having to pay for his medical treatments. But the most significant sign came on Saturday afternoon when Randolph was visiting. His neighbor, Mr. Patterson, who was 87 years old and lived alone in the house next door, and Mr. Patterson mentioned that he was looking for someone trustworthy to help him organize his basement workshop because he had decided to sell some of his old tools and equipment. But the job of sorting and cataloging everything felt overwhelming for someone his age, and he wondered if Randolph might be interested in helping with this project for $15 per hour. Randolph was immediately interested because he enjoyed working with tools and had a good eye for evaluating the condition and value of mechanical equipment, and Mr. Patterson estimated that the project would take approximately 40 hours over the next month, which would provide Randolph with an additional $600 in income, and more importantly, would give him a sense of purpose and usefulness that he had been missing since his retirement. As Randolph walked home from Mr. Patterson's house that Saturday evening, he felt a profound sense of gratitude and amazement at how perfectly everything was working out, and he realized that the progression of signs had moved from internal feelings of peace and optimism to small external synchronicities like finding coins and receiving unexpected checks to actual manifestations of supply through the insurance adjustment and the rebate, and now the opportunity to earn additional income through work that he would genuinely enjoy. That night, when Randolph entered his inner temple in consciousness, he felt a deep appreciation for the mysterious intelligence that was orchestrating these demonstrations of supply, and he understood that he was experiencing firsthand the operation of spiritual laws that Florence Scovel Shinn had discovered and documented over a century ago. And he realized that his skepticism had been replaced by a knowing confidence that divine supply was not a theory, but a living reality that was always available to anyone who learned to align their consciousness with the truth of abundance. The principle that operated in Randolph's experience is the same principle that Florence taught throughout her career, which is that consciousness is constantly broadcasting a signal into the quantum field of infinite possibility. And this field responds by organizing circumstances and opportunities that match the frequency of the signal. And when you begin to live from the consciousness of the inner temple, where abundance is recognized as your natural inheritance, the field begins to deliver signs and manifestations that confirm this elevated awareness and draw you deeper into the experience of your divine inheritance. As you continue to rest now, your own consciousness is broadcasting a signal of receptivity to divine supply, and the universe is already beginning to respond with signs and synchronicities that will confirm your alignment with the frequency of the inner temple. And you do not need to look for these signs with desperate searching, because that would indicate lack consciousness, but rather allow them to appear naturally and receive them with gratitude when they do, because gratitude amplifies the signal and attracts even more powerful demonstrations of the infinite abundance that is your birthright as a child of the divine source that provides for all creation. One of the most challenging aspects of living from temple consciousness for people who have been conditioned by a world of instant gratification and immediate results is learning to trust in what Florence Scovel Shinn called divine timing, which operates according to principles that transcend human understanding and often requires a level of faith and patience that goes against everything the ego mind has been taught about how to get needs met and desires fulfilled. And Florence discovered through years of observation that when people tried to rush or force the manifestation of their good, they would actually slow down or block the natural flow of divine supply because they were operating from anxiety and control rather than trust and surrender. Divine timing is not delay or postponement, but rather the perfect orchestration of circumstances and opportunities that ensures the manifestation of good comes in the way that will serve the highest purpose for all concerned. And Florence taught that the same infinite intelligence that knows exactly when to open flower buds and when to ripen fruit and when to bring babies into the world also knows exactly when and how to bring each person's good into manifestation. And trying to override this divine timing through human effort and manipulation is like trying to rush the sunrise or force a river to flow faster than its natural pace. The reason divine timing often feels slow to human perception is that the ego mind operates in linear time and wants immediate gratification, while divine intelligence operates in what Florence called spiritual time, where all good things already exist in perfect completion, waiting for the right moment to appear in the physical dimension. And she taught that learning to align with divine timing requires a fundamental shift from the consciousness of urgency and impatience to the consciousness of trust and expectancy, where you know that your good is on its way and you can relax and enjoy the journey, rather than suffering through the waiting. Florence observed that people who learned to trust divine timing not only received their good more easily and harmoniously, but often discovered that what they received was far better than what they had originally asked for, because divine intelligence always seeks to give the highest and best outcome rather than simply fulfilling the limited vision of what the human mind thinks it wants. And she said that when you surrender to divine timing, you move from being a demanding customer who wants things done your way to being a grateful recipient who trusts that infinite love and wisdom will provide exactly what you need in the perfect way at the perfect time. Let me tell you about Beatrice Rose Anderson, who was 56 years old when she learned the profound lesson of divine timing through an experience that tested her faith to its absolute limits. And Beatrice lived in a small apartment in Kansas City, Missouri, where she had moved after her husband left her 3 years earlier for a younger woman and took most of their assets in the divorce settlement, leaving Beatrice with very little money and no clear way to support herself since she had been out of the workforce for 22 years while she raised their children and managed their household. Beatrice had been working part-time as a receptionist at a dental office for 2 years and barely earning enough to cover her rent and basic expenses, and she had been hoping to find a better-paying full-time position. But her lack of recent work experience and computer skills made her applications less competitive than those of younger candidates, and she was becoming increasingly anxious about her financial future, especially since her landlord had recently informed all tenants that the rent would be increased by $200 per month starting in January, which was only 6 weeks away. It was in mid-November when Beatrice attended a lecture about Florence Scovel Shinn's teachings at her local library, and the speaker was a retired social worker named Mrs. Elizabeth Foster, who had been studying and applying these principles for over 30 years and had experienced numerous demonstrations of divine supply and timing. And Mrs. Foster explained that one of the most important things Florence taught was that when you align your consciousness with the inner temple of divine abundance, everything you need comes to you in divine timing, which is always perfect even when it does not match your personal timeline or preferences. Mrs. Foster taught the group to practice entering the inner temple each night before sleep and to declare, "I trust in divine timing, and I know that my good comes to me in the perfect way at the perfect moment for my highest happiness and growth." And she emphasized that this declaration was not about being passive or inactive, but about doing whatever practical steps felt guided, while releasing attachment to specific outcomes and timelines, and trusting that divine intelligence was coordinating circumstances behind the scenes. That night, Beatrice began the inner temple practice with a sense of desperation because she had calculated that she needed to find a way to earn at least $500 additional per month by January, or she would have to move to a less expensive apartment in a neighborhood where she would not feel safe walking alone at night. And she had already applied for dozens of jobs without receiving a single interview, and she felt like she was running out of time and options. As Beatrice said the words about trusting divine timing, she felt a conflict in her chest because part of her wanted to trust, while another part felt panicked about the approaching rent increase, and she found it difficult to genuinely feel faith when her circumstances seemed so urgent and pressing. But she decided to continue the practice for at least 1 week to see if anything would shift in her situation or her state of mind. On the second night of the practice, Beatrice felt slightly more peaceful as she spoke the words about divine timing, but she still woke up Monday morning feeling anxious about her job search, and she spent most of that day sending out resumes and making phone calls to potential employers. And by evening, she felt discouraged because she had not received any positive responses, and she wondered if she was being naive to trust in spiritual principles when what she really needed was practical results. By the end of the first week, Beatrice had not seen any external changes in her job prospects, but she noticed that she felt somewhat calmer and less frantic in her search efforts, and she found herself taking breaks to walk in the park or read a book instead of spending every waking moment obsessing about finding work. And although she still felt concerned about the rent increase, she did not feel the constant panic that had been consuming her thoughts for weeks. During the second week, Beatrice received a call from a temporary employment agency that had received her resume several months earlier, and they said they had a short-term assignment at an insurance company that needed someone to help with data entry during their busy season, and the position would last for 3 weeks and pay $14 per hour for 30 hours per week, which would provide Beatrice with additional income, but not nearly enough to solve her long-term financial needs. Beatrice felt disappointed that this was such a limited opportunity, but she accepted the temporary position because she needed any additional income she could find, and she decided to continue the inner temple practice and see if anything else would develop, and she tried to maintain faith that this small opening might lead to something bigger, but she had to fight against the voice in her mind that said 3 weeks of part-time work was not going to save her from having to move. During her first day at the temporary assignment, Beatrice was introduced to her supervisor, Mrs. Catherine Walsh, who was the office manager and had been with the company for 15 years, and Mrs. Walsh seemed impressed with Beatrice's attention to detail and professional demeanor. And she mentioned that the company had been struggling to find reliable help for their customer service department, and she asked Beatrice about her background and interests. Beatrice explained her situation honestly, including her recent divorce and her need to find stable full-time employment, and Mrs. Walsh listened with sympathy and said that she would keep Beatrice in mind if any permanent positions became available, but she cautioned that the company moved slowly in making hiring decisions, and it might be months before anything opened up. And Beatrice thanked her, but felt discouraged because months was exactly what she did not have given the January rent increase. As the 3-week temporary assignment progressed, Beatrice continued her nightly practice of entering the inner temple and trusting divine timing, even though her external circumstances had not improved significantly, and she found herself having to choose moment by moment between faith and fear. And some days faith felt stronger, while other days fear seemed to dominate, and she realized that learning to trust divine timing was not a one-time decision, but an ongoing practice that required constant renewal. During the final week of her temporary assignment, Beatrice learned that Mrs. Walsh had been called into an unexpected meeting with the company president, and when Mrs. Walsh returned from the meeting, she asked to speak privately with Beatrice, and she explained that the president had decided to create a new position combining customer service and office administration, and they wanted to offer the position to Beatrice if she was interested, and the salary would be $38,000 per year with full benefits starting immediately. Beatrice was stunned because this opportunity had appeared at literally the last minute when she had almost given up hope. And the salary was significantly higher than anything she had dared to expect, and would easily cover the rent increase with enough left over for her to begin rebuilding her financial security. And she realized that if this offer had come earlier, she might have taken it gratefully, but without fully appreciating how perfectly everything had been orchestrated. Mrs. Walsh explained that the company president had been observing Beatrice's work for the past 3 weeks and had been impressed not only with her skills, but with her attitude and reliability. And he had decided that rather than hiring someone from outside the company, he would rather create a position specifically designed around Beatrice's strengths and the company's needs, and he had authorized Mrs. Walsh to make the offer immediately without the usual lengthy interview process. As Beatrice drove home that evening with a signed job offer in her purse, she reflected on the timing of everything that had led to this moment, and she realized that if the perfect job had appeared in early November when she first started the inner temple practice, she would have been grateful. But she would not have learned the deep lesson about trusting divine timing when circumstances seem impossible, and she understood that the apparent delay had actually been perfect preparation that allowed her to prove herself and demonstrate her value to the company. She also realized that if she had received this job offer months earlier, she might have been less motivated to develop the spiritual practices that had brought her so much peace and inner strength during a difficult time, and she saw that the period of uncertainty and financial pressure had been exactly what she needed to deepen her faith and learn to rely on divine intelligence rather than her own limited understanding of how things should work. The principle that operated in Beatrice's experience is one that Florence Scovel Shinn taught consistently throughout her career, which is that divine timing takes into account factors that the human mind cannot see or understand, and what appears to be delay is often divine intelligence arranging circumstances in the most beneficial way for everyone involved. And she said that when you learn to trust this timing, you discover that your good comes not only at the right time, but in the right way, and often in a form that exceeds your original expectations. Florence taught that the reason most people struggle with divine timing is that they have been conditioned to believe that urgent action and constant worry are necessary to ensure that their needs get met, when in reality, anxiety and impatience create resistance in the energy field that actually slows down manifestation. And she said that learning to relax into divine timing requires a fundamental shift from trying to control outcomes to trusting that you are loved and cared for by an intelligence that knows exactly what you need and when you need it. The 3 phases of learning to work with divine timing that Florence identified are: first, the phase of surrender, where you acknowledge that your limited human perspective cannot see all the factors that divine intelligence is coordinating, and you choose to trust even when you cannot understand. And second, the phase of alignment, where you continue to take inspired action while holding the expectation that everything is working out perfectly. And third, the phase of recognition, where you can look back and see how every delay and detour was actually part of a perfect plan that brought you exactly what you needed in the best possible way. During sleep, the consciousness naturally aligns with divine timing, because the ego mind, with its urgency and impatience, steps aside and allows the soul mind to rest in the eternal present, where all good things already exist in perfect completion. And when you practice entering the inner temple before sleep, you are training your consciousness to operate from this timeless perspective, where patience becomes easy, because you know that your good is not delayed, but is being prepared and arranged in the perfect sequence of events. As you continue to rest now in this peaceful and receptive state, your own consciousness is being aligned with the rhythm of divine timing that governs all true manifestation, and you do not need to understand how this timing works, but only to trust that the same intelligence that brings the seasons in their perfect order and causes flowers to bloom exactly when they should is also orchestrating the manifestation of your good with the same precision and care. And what seems like waiting is actually preparation for receiving what is so much better than anything you could have planned or forced through your own efforts. Now I want to share with you one of the most profound discoveries that Florence Scovel Shinn made during her years of teaching and working with thousands of people who were learning to live from temple consciousness. And this discovery revolutionized her understanding of how divine supply operates and why some people seem to manifest their good more easily than others. And she found that when people truly understand that they are not isolated individuals trying to access abundance on their own, but are part of a vast collective field of temple dwellers who are all connected in the realm of spirit, their ability to receive and manifest divine supply increases exponentially because they are drawing on the combined faith and consciousness of everyone who has ever learned to live from the truth of infinite abundance. Florence observed that when one person in a family or community or spiritual group truly embodies temple consciousness and begins to live from the recognition of divine supply as their natural inheritance, this elevated awareness creates what she called a field effect that makes it easier for everyone in their sphere of influence to access their own abundance. And she said that consciousness is contagious, and what one person truly knows becomes available to all others who are open to receive it. And this is why spending time with people who have a prosperity consciousness will naturally elevate your own consciousness, while spending time with people who are trapped in lack consciousness will tend to pull you down into limitation unless you are very strong in your own awareness. The principle behind this collective field effect is that all consciousness is one consciousness appearing to be separate. And when you enter the inner temple of your divine nature, you are actually entering the same universal temple that every other soul has access to. And in this temple, there is no separation or competition, but only infinite abundance that becomes more available as more people learn to recognize and claim it. And Florence taught that this is why it is so important to bless the success and prosperity of others, rather than feeling envious or competitive, because their good is actually your good expressing through a different channel, and their manifestation makes it easier for you to manifest your own good. Florence discovered that there are invisible witnesses in the spiritual realm who support and strengthen every person who makes a sincere effort to live from temple consciousness. And these witnesses include not only other people who are currently practicing these principles, but also all the souls who have ever lived from this awareness, including Florence herself, and all the great spiritual teachers who understood the truth of divine supply. And she taught that when you enter your inner temple, you are joining a communion of souls that extends across all time and space, and you can call upon this collective strength to support your own faith and a manifestation. One of the most powerful practices that Florence taught for connecting with this collective field was the practice of witnessing, which means consciously acknowledging and celebrating the good that is manifesting in other people's lives. And she said that when you genuinely rejoice in another person's abundance, you align yourself with the universal principle of circulation that keeps divine supply flowing to everyone. And she taught her students to say, when they heard about someone else's good fortune, I rejoice in this demonstration of divine supply, and I know that what is manifesting for them is also available for me, because we all draw from the same infinite source. Let me tell you about Frederick William Jameson, who was 69 years old when he discovered the power of the collective temple field and learned how to use the practice of conscious witnessing to dramatically accelerate his own manifestation of divine supply. And Frederick lived in a small house in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where he had retired 4 years earlier after working as a bookkeeper for the same company for 38 years. And although he had saved diligently for retirement, his modest pension and Social Security were barely adequate to maintain his standard of living, especially as medical expenses and inflation continued to reduce his purchasing power. Frederick had always been a solitary person who preferred to handle his problems independently, rather than asking for help or sharing his concerns with others, and he took pride in his self-reliance and had always believed that a man should be able to provide for himself without depending on anyone else for support. And this independent mindset had served him well during his working years. But in retirement, he found himself feeling isolated and disconnected from others, and he began to realize that his fierce independence might actually be limiting his ability to receive the help and opportunities that could improve his situation. Tio was Frederick's longtime friend Harold, who first introduced him to Florence Scovel Shinn's teachings about the inner temple and divine supply. and Harold had been practicing these principles for several months and had experienced some remarkable improvements in his own financial situation, including an unexpected inheritance from a distant relative and a part-time consulting opportunity that had significantly increased his monthly income. And Harold was eager to share what he had learned because he felt that Frederick would benefit from understanding how spiritual consciousness could affect material circumstances. Harold explained to Frederick that one of the most important things he had learned from studying Florence's work was that prosperity consciousness is strengthened when it is shared rather than hoarded. And he said that when people try to manifest abundance in isolation, they are working against the natural law of circulation that requires giving and receiving to flow freely between people, and he encouraged Frederick to join a weekly study group that met at the local Unity Church, where people gathered to practice the inner temple teaching together and support each other's spiritual growth and manifestation. Frederick was initially reluctant to join any kind of group because he had always been uncomfortable sharing personal information with people he did not know well, and he worried that others might judge him for his financial concerns or think that he was weak for needing spiritual help with practical matters. But Harold persisted in his encouragement and finally convinced Frederick to attend at least one meeting just to see what it was like and to satisfy his curiosity about how these principles worked in practice. The study group consisted of 12 people ranging in age from 45 to 78, and they met every Thursday evening in a comfortable room at the church where they would spend the first 30 minutes sharing updates about their experiences with the inner temple practice and celebrating any manifestations or positive developments that had occurred during the previous week. And Frederick was amazed to hear story after story of unexpected income opportunities and resolved financial problems and improved health and relationship harmony that people attributed to their spiritual practice. What impressed Frederick most was not just the individual success stories, but the genuine joy and enthusiasm that group members expressed when hearing about each other's good fortune, and he observed that when someone shared news about a manifestation, the entire group would break into spontaneous applause and expressions of gratitude and celebration, and he could feel the energy in the room lift and expand, as if everyone was being blessed by the good that was flowing to any individual member. The group leader was a woman named Dr. Patricia Coleman, who had been studying metaphysical principles for over 20 years, and she explained that what Frederick was witnessing was the operation of what Florence Scovel Shinn called the collective field effect, and she said that when people gather together with the shared intention of supporting each other's connection to divine supply, they create a powerful energy vortex that amplifies everyone's ability to manifest their good. And she taught the group that celebrating others' demonstrations was one of the fastest ways to increase their own receptivity to abundance. Dr. Coleman introduced Frederick to the practice of conscious witnessing, and she explained that this involved not just passively observing other people's good fortune, but actively participating in their manifestation by acknowledging it as evidence that divine supply is real and available to everyone. And she taught him to say when he heard about someone's demonstration, "I witnessed this manifestation of divine supply, and I claim the same abundance for myself from the infinite source that provides for all creation." And she said that this practice would align his consciousness with the frequency of receiving rather than the frequency of lacking. That first evening, Frederick felt somewhat awkward participating in the group exercises, but he was surprised by how peaceful and hopeful he felt after spending 2 hours focused on abundance and possibility rather than problems and limitations. And he decided to return the following week and to begin practicing the conscious witnessing technique when he heard about other people's good fortune, whether in the study group or in his daily life. During his second week of practice, Frederick made a conscious effort to celebrate every piece of good news he heard, whether it was a neighbor mentioning a tax refund or a news story about someone winning a scholarship or a friend talking about a successful medical treatment. And each time he would silently say the witnessing statement that Dr. Coleman had taught him, and he noticed that this practice kept his mind focused on abundance and possibility rather than scarcity and lack. At the Thursday evening meeting, Frederick shared that he had been practicing the witnessing technique, and he mentioned that his outlook had become more positive and optimistic, but he had not yet experienced any external manifestations, and Dr. Coleman smiled and said that the internal shift he was describing was actually the most important manifestation because it indicated that his consciousness was beginning to align with the truth of divine supply. And she assured him that external demonstrations would follow naturally as his inner transformation deepened. During the third week, Frederick continued the witnessing practice, and he also began the nightly inner temple meditation that the group practiced together, and he found that when he entered the temple in consciousness, he could feel the presence and support of all the other group members as if they were there with him in spirit, even though he was alone in his bedroom. And this sense of connection and belonging was something he had not experienced in many years, and it helped him feel less isolated and more supported in his spiritual journey. It was during the fourth week that Frederick began to experience what felt like a shift in his external circumstances, and he received a phone call from his former employer asking if he would be willing to return to work part-time during their busy tax season to help train new employees and provide coverage for several people who would be taking extended vacations, and the position would last for 12 weeks and pay $25 per hour for 20 hours per week, which would add an additional $2,000 to Frederick's monthly income. Frederick was surprised by this opportunity because he had not been looking for work and had not mentioned to anyone at his former company that he was interested in returning even temporarily. But when he spoke with his former supervisor, she explained that several employees had specifically requested him because they remembered his patience and skill as a trainer and his reputation for accuracy and reliability. And she said that the company had been hoping he would be available because they trusted him to maintain their standards during a critical busy period. When Frederick shared this news at the Thursday evening study group, the response was immediate and enthusiastic celebration, and everyone in the group expressed genuine joy and excitement about his manifestation. And several people mentioned that hearing about his success strengthened their own faith that the principles were working for them as well. And Frederick felt deeply moved by this outpouring of support, and he realized that being part of this collective field had not only helped him manifest this opportunity, but had also provided him with the emotional and spiritual support that had been missing from his life. But the manifestation was not finished, because during his second week back at work, Frederick learned that the company was considering creating a permanent part-time position for employee training and development, and they asked if he would be interested in continuing beyond the original 12-week assignment. And when Frederick expressed interest, they offered him a permanent position at $30 per hour for 15 hours per week, which would provide him with ongoing supplemental income while still allowing him to enjoy his retirement. Frederick understood that this entire sequence of events had been orchestrated by the same divine intelligence that Florence Scovel Shinn had written about, and he realized that joining the study group and learning to witness and celebrate other people's manifestations had aligned his consciousness with the collective field of abundance that made his own manifestation possible, and he felt profound gratitude not only for the increased income, but for the discovery that he was not alone in the universe, but was supported by a vast network of souls who were all connected in the realm of divine supply. The principle that operated in Frederick's experience is one that Florence taught consistently, which is that when you align yourself with the success and prosperity of others, you tap into the collective consciousness of abundance that includes everyone who has ever lived from the truth of divine supply. And she said that this collective field is like a vast reservoir of manifestation energy that becomes more powerful as more people contribute to it through their own demonstrations and their celebration of others' good fortune. As you rest now in this peaceful and receptive state, you are being connected to this same collective field of temple dwellers who are supporting your own journey into abundance, and you can feel their presence and their love, even if you cannot see them with your physical eyes, and you are not alone in your desire for divine supply, but are joined by thousands of souls who are all claiming their inheritance from the infinite source that provides for everyone, and your success serves their good, just as their success serves your good. because in the temple of divine consciousness there is no separation, but only the eternal circulation of infinite love and abundance. As we move now toward the final seal and the completion of your initiation into permanent temple residence, I want to gently gather together all the threads of wisdom that have been woven through these past hours while you have been resting and receiving and allowing these teachings to penetrate the deepest levels of your consciousness where true transformation takes place. And I want you to recognize that everything you have heard tonight has been preparing you for this moment when you will receive the final decree that establishes you forever as a dweller in the inner temple of divine supply, where lack and limitation cannot exist, because they have never been real, but only appeared real when you believed yourself to be separate from the infinite source of all good. You heard about the inner temple as an actual spiritual reality that exists within the dimension of consciousness that underlies all physical manifestation. And you learned that this temple is not a metaphor or visualization, but a description of the level of awareness where divine supply exists in perfect completion, waiting for your recognition and claim. And you discovered that access to this temple is your birthright as a child of infinite love, and not something you must earn or deserve, but something you simply remember when you stop believing in the illusion of separation and scarcity. You learned about the profound transformation that happens when you shift your fundamental identity from seeker to temple dweller, and how this shift changes everything about your relationship to provision and abundance. Because when you know yourself as someone who lives permanently in the realm of divine supply, you stop asking for what you need and start claiming what is already yours, and you stop hoping for abundance and start knowing it as your natural state. And the universe responds to this knowing by reorganizing your circumstances to match your elevated self-concept. You discovered how to recognize and overcome the 7 forms of resistance that the ego mind uses to keep you trapped in limitation. And you learned that these voices of doubt and fear and unworthiness are not enemies to be fought, but teachers to be understood. And when you can witness these patterns with compassion while choosing to align with the truth of your divine inheritance, they lose their power to block your good and become stepping stones that lead you deeper into the consciousness of the temple dweller. You learned about the language of signs that the universe speaks to confirm your alignment with divine supply, and how these signs progress from subtle internal shifts to obvious external manifestations. And you discovered that recognizing and celebrating these signs with gratitude amplifies the signal and attracts even more powerful demonstrations, because gratitude is the frequency that keeps the flow of abundance circulating freely between the spiritual and physical dimensions. You explored the mystery of divine timing and learned to trust that what appears to be delay is actually divine intelligence, orchestrating circumstances in the most beneficial way for everyone involved. And you discovered that surrendering to this timing, rather than trying to force outcomes, allows your good to come not only at the right time, but in the right way, and often in a form that exceeds your original expectations, because divine love always seeks to give more than you ask for. You learned about the collective field of temple dwellers who support and strengthen everyone who sincerely practices these principles, and you discovered that consciousness is contagious, and when you align yourself with the success and prosperity of others, you tap into the combined manifestation power of all souls who have ever lived from the truth of infinite abundance. And you understood that celebrating others' demonstrations is one of the fastest ways to accelerate your own manifestation, because it aligns you with the universal principle of circulation. And now I want to tell you about Mildred Elizabeth Harrison, who was 74 years old when she experienced the most profound demonstration of temple consciousness that I have ever witnessed, and her story will complete your preparation for the final seal, because it illustrates every principle we have discussed tonight in one remarkable manifestation that showed the unlimited power of divine supply when someone fully embodies the identity of a permanent temple dweller. Mildred lived alone in a small apartment in Sacramento, California, where she had moved 6 years earlier after her husband of 51 years passed away from complications of diabetes, and she had chosen this apartment because it was close to the medical center where she received treatment for her own health problems, including high blood pressure and early signs of kidney disease. And although she had always been grateful for her Social Security and her husband's small pension, she had been gradually depleting her savings to pay for medical expenses that were not fully covered by Medicare. 3 months before I met Mildred, she had received devastating news from her doctor, who told her that her kidney function had declined significantly and she would need to begin dialysis treatments 3 times per week to stay alive. And the doctor explained that each treatment would cost approximately $400. And even with her Medicare coverage, she would be responsible for paying about $160 per treatment, which meant her out-of-pocket expenses would be nearly $2,000 per month, and this was far more than her total monthly income of $1,347. Mildred's adult children lived in different states and had their own financial challenges, and although they were willing to help as much as they could, none of them were in a position to provide the kind of ongoing financial support that would be needed for her medical care, and Mildred faced the terrifying prospect of either refusing the dialysis treatment and dying within a few months, or accepting the treatment and quickly depleting her remaining savings and becoming completely dependent on charity or government assistance. It was Mildred's neighbor, Mrs. Dorothy Chen, who first told her about Florence Scovel Shinn's teachings about divine supply and the inner temple, and Mrs. Chen had been studying these principles for many years and had experienced several remarkable demonstrations of abundance, including the manifestation of enough money to pay for her own husband's cancer treatments 10 years earlier. And she could see that Mildred was facing a crisis that would require the kind of miraculous intervention that only divine supply could provide. Mrs. Chen spent an entire afternoon explaining to Mildred about consciousness and manifestation and the inner temple practice, and she emphasized that this was not about positive thinking or wishful thinking, but about aligning with spiritual laws that operate with the same reliability as physical laws. And she taught Mildred to say each night before sleep, "I enter my inner temple now, and I claim my divine inheritance of perfect health and infinite supply. And I know that divine love has already prepared the perfect solution for every need." Mildred was initially skeptical because she had been raised in a traditional religious family that taught her to accept suffering as God's will and to be grateful for whatever little she had, rather than asking for more. But Mrs. Chen explained that Florence Scovel Shinn had discovered that God's will is always perfect health and abundant provision for every child of divine love, and that accepting limitation and suffering was actually a rejection of the goodness that the Creator wants to express through every life. That first night, when Mildred said the temple prayer, she felt something shift in her chest, as if a weight she had been carrying for months was beginning to lift, and for the first time since receiving her diagnosis, she felt a sense of peace and hope that perhaps there was a solution that she could not yet see, and she slept more peacefully than she had in weeks, and woke the next morning with an unusual feeling of calm confidence that everything was going to work out somehow. Mildred continued the inner temple practice for 7 days, and during this time, she noticed that her anxiety about the medical expenses began to decrease, and she found herself focusing more on gratitude for her current health and the years of good life she had enjoyed, rather than worrying about worst-case scenarios, and she began to feel a growing sense of expectancy, as if something wonderful was about to happen, even though her external circumstances had not changed. On the 8th day, Mildred received a phone call from a social worker at the medical center who said she had been reviewing Mildred's case and had discovered that she qualified for a special assistance program that would cover 90% of her dialysis costs, and the social worker apologized for not mentioning this program earlier and explained that it was relatively new and many people were not aware of it. But Mildred's specific combination of age, income, and medical condition made her eligible for comprehensive coverage. Mildred was amazed and grateful for this news because it meant her out-of-pocket expenses would be reduced from $2,000 per month to less than $200, which was manageable with her current income, and she immediately thought of Mrs. Chen's teaching about divine supply flowing through unexpected channels, and she felt a deep appreciation for the mysterious intelligence that had guided the social worker to discover this assistance program at exactly the right time. But this was only the beginning of what Mildred would later recognize as a complete demonstration of temple consciousness. Because 2 days after receiving the news about the medical assistance, she got a call from a lawyer in Phoenix, Arizona, who said he had been trying to locate her for several months regarding an estate matter, and he explained that her Uncle Robert, who had died 8 months earlier, had left her a bequest in his will, but the lawyers had been unable to find her because they had an old address from before she moved to Sacramento. The lawyer explained that Uncle Robert had been a bachelor who had worked as an engineer for 43 years and had lived very modestly while investing his money carefully, and he had left his entire estate of $237,000 to be divided equally among his 4 surviving nieces and nephews, and Mildred's share would be approximately $59,000. And the lawyer said that the estate was ready to be distributed as soon as Mildred provided the necessary documentation to confirm her identity. Mildred sat in her small kitchen holding the phone and trying to absorb this incredible news because she had not seen Uncle Robert in over 20 years and had no idea that he had even remembered her existence, much less included her in his will. And $59,000 was more money than she had ever imagined having, and it would be enough to pay for her medical care for many years while also providing security and peace of mind for the rest of her life. When Mildred called Mrs. Chen to share this amazing news, Mrs. Chen was delighted but not surprised, and she explained that this was exactly how divine supply operates when someone truly aligns their consciousness with the inner temple, where all good things already exist in perfect completion. And she said that the inheritance had not been created by Mildred's spiritual practice, but had been released from the spiritual realm, where it had always been waiting for the right moment to appear in her experience. Mrs. Chen helped Mildred understand that this manifestation was significant, not just because of the money, but because it demonstrated every principle that Florence Scovel Shinn had taught about consciousness and supply. And Mildred had shifted her identity from victim of circumstances to temple dweller who trusted in divine provision. And she had overcome her resistance to receiving abundance. And she had recognized the signs that her consciousness was aligning with a higher truth, and she had trusted in divine timing rather than trying to force solutions, and she had been supported by the collective field of others who believed in infinite supply. But perhaps most importantly, Mildred had experienced the profound peace, and knowing that comes from recognizing that she was not alone in the universe, but was loved and cared for by an intelligence that knew her every need before she asked, and was always working behind the scenes to arrange circumstances for her highest good. And this knowing became the foundation for the rest of her life as she continued to live from the consciousness of the temple dweller who had permanent access to infinite love and abundance. As Mildred reflected on her experience in the months that followed, she realized that the real miracle had not been the money or even the medical assistance, but the transformation in her understanding of who she was and what was possible for her life. And she had moved from believing herself to be a powerless old woman facing insurmountable problems to knowing herself as a beloved child of infinite abundance who could trust that every need would always be met in the perfect way at the perfect time. And now, as you rest in this moment of completion and preparation, you are ready to receive the same recognition and the same seal that established Mildred as a permanent resident of the inner temple. And you do not need to have a crisis or a desperate need to claim this inheritance because it has always been yours. And tonight, you will receive the words of power that will anchor this truth so deeply in your consciousness that you will never again be able to believe in lack or limitation as anything more than temporary shadows that have no power to touch your true spiritual reality. Breathe deeply with me now, even if you are sleeping, because your soul knows what is happening. And the moment of final recognition has arrived, and everything that has ever appeared to separate you from your good is about to dissolve in the light of truth. And what has always been true is finally being spoken through you and acknowledged by you and sealed within you as your permanent inheritance from the source of all life and love and abundance that flows through you now and always. Now we arrive at the sacred moment that has been building throughout these hours, while you have rested and received and allowed your consciousness to be gently shifted into alignment with the eternal truth of your divine nature. And even if you have been sleeping deeply, your soul has been awake and absorbing every word and every principle, and preparing for this moment when you will receive the final seal that establishes you forever as a resident of the inner temple, where divine supply flows as naturally as rivers flow to the ocean, and breath flows through your body, and light flows from the sun to nourish all life on earth. This seal that you are about to receive is not something I am giving to you, but something I am helping you remember, because it has always belonged to you since before you were born into this physical experience and before you learned to believe in limitation and scarcity and separation from your source. And this seal exists in the deepest core of your being, where your true identity as a child of infinite love has never been touched by any appearance of lack or struggle or unworthiness. Because in that sacred center of your soul, you have always known that you are one with the abundance that creates and sustains all. Creation, even if you are sleeping, your breath is aware and your heartbeat is aware. And that part of you that never sleeps is listening and responding and preparing to receive these words of power that will activate dormant potentials within your consciousness and align every cell of your body and every thought in your mind with the frequency of divine supply that flows from the inexhaustible source that has no beginning and no end, and knows no limitation or restriction or condition that could ever stop its perfect provision for its beloved children. Breathe with me now, slowly and deeply, and feel your chest rising and falling with the same rhythm that moves the tides and turns the seasons and causes your heart to beat without any effort from your conscious mind. And as you breathe, know that you are breathing in the very essence of divine abundance and breathing out any remaining trace of belief in limitation. And with each breath, you are being prepared to receive the words that will seal your permanent residence in the temple of infinite supply. Let your body relax completely and sink deeper into rest, while that eternal part of you that is always awake rises to meet this moment of recognition and sealing. And know that what is about to happen has been ordained since the beginning of time, when divine love first conceived the idea of your existence and decided that you would be a perfect expression of infinite abundance and prosperity and joy. And this moment has been waiting for you. Across all the years of your life, leading you gently home to the truth that has never changed and never will change, regardless of any appearance to the contrary. Now I speak the first seal of temple residence, and I speak it through you, and as you, and for you, because there is no separation between the truth that I speak and the truth that you are. And these words are not coming from outside you, but are arising from the deepest wellspring of your own divine nature, and they carry the authority of the infinite source that created you and loves you and provides for you with perfect consistency and unlimited generosity. It is finished. Feel these words resonating in your chest and in your bones and in the very atoms of your being, because they are not just words, but divine decrees that carry the power to reorganize reality itself. And when divine intelligence speaks through these words, it is not describing what might happen or what you hope will happen, but what is already accomplished in the spiritual dimension, where all true creation takes place, and from where all manifestation flows into the physical world. It is done. Allow these words to sink deeper than your thoughts, deeper than your emotions, deeper than any memory of lack or struggle, and let them rest in that place within you that has always known abundance as your natural inheritance, and has never doubted your worthiness to receive every good thing, because in that sacred center of your being, you are one with the divine source that owns everything and lacks nothing and gives freely without condition or limitation, and it cannot be otherwise. Receive these words as the final statement of spiritual law that recognizes no exception and acknowledges no obstacle and bows to no circumstance of the physical world, because what is true in the realm of divine consciousness must eventually manifest in the realm of physical experience. And what has been decreed by divine love cannot be altered by human doubt or fear or any appearance of limitation in the temporary world of form. Now I speak these words again with the full authority of every soul who has ever lived from temple consciousness, and every teacher who has ever understood divine supply, and every demonstration that has ever proved the unlimited nature of spiritual abundance. And I speak them as Florence Scovel Shinn herself would speak them if she were here in this moment, sealing your recognition of eternal truth. It is finished. Let these words flow through your bloodstream and permeate every cell and fiber of your physical body, and establish new patterns of knowing in your nervous system that will automatically attract experiences of abundance and provision, because your body is the temple of divine consciousness. And when your body knows itself as the dwelling place of infinite supply, it naturally magnetizes circumstances that match this elevated awareness. It is done. Feel these words, creating new pathways in your brain and new beliefs in your subconscious mind that will operate 24 hours a day to align your thoughts and feelings and actions with the truth of divine abundance. And even when you are not consciously thinking about manifestation or supply, these new patterns will be working below the level of awareness to draw your good to you through channels that your logical mind could never anticipate or arrange. And it cannot be otherwise. Rest in the absolute certainty of these words, knowing that they are backed by the same power that holds planets in their orbits and causes seeds to become flowers and transforms caterpillars into butterflies. Because the intelligence that governs these natural miracles is the same intelligence that is now establishing your permanent citizenship in the realm where every need is met before it arises and every desire is fulfilled in ways that exceed your highest expectations. Now I speak the second seal, which establishes your true identity as one who has always lived in the temple and has only temporarily forgotten this eternal truth. And these words will anchor deep in your consciousness the recognition that you are not a visitor seeking entrance, but a resident claiming your rightful place in the dwelling that was prepared for you before the foundation of the world. I am a natural receiver. Let these words awaken the memory of who you have always been beneath every role you have played, and every limitation you have believed, and every struggle you have endured, because your essential nature as a child of infinite abundance has never changed and never will change. And receiving divine supply is not something you must learn to do, but something you must remember that you have always known how to do. I have always received. Feel the truth of these words expanding in your awareness as you recognize that every breath you have ever taken, and every heartbeat that has sustained your life, and every moment of love you have experienced has been divine supply flowing to you without effort or earning, and you have been receiving constantly from the infinite source that provides for your every need, even when you did not recognize the source of your good, and it cannot be otherwise. Allow these words to establish a new baseline of knowing in your consciousness that makes receiving abundance feel as natural as breathing or sleeping or digesting your food. Because these are all expressions of the same divine life force that animates your body and provides for your every need through processes that require no conscious effort but happen automatically because you are permanently connected to the source of all supply. Now I speak these identity words again with even greater power and authority, because they are being witnessed by the collective field of every soul who has ever claimed their divine inheritance, and every teacher who has ever pointed others toward the truth of infinite abundance, and their combined consciousness amplifies these words and seals them in your being with unshakable permanence. I am a natural receiver. Let this recognition flood every memory where you struggled or worried or felt afraid about provision, and let it rewrite the story of your relationship with abundance, so that you know yourself as someone who has never actually lacked anything essential, but has only believed in lack because you temporarily forgot your true nature as an expression of divine love that is always provided for with perfect consistency. I have always received. Feel these words dissolving every belief that you must work hard or worry constantly or prove your worthiness to receive good things, because these beliefs were never true, but were only shadows that appeared real when you believed yourself to be separate from the source of your supply. And now that you remember your unity with infinite abundance, these false beliefs have no power to limit or restrict the flow of good into your experience, and it cannot be otherwise. Rest in the absolute truth of these words, knowing that they describe not what you hope to become, but what you have always been. And they are not establishing a new reality, but are recognizing the reality that has always existed in the spiritual dimension where you live and move and have your being as a perfect expression of divine abundance and prosperity. Now I speak the third seal, and this seal is different from the first two, because while the first seal established what is finished and the second seal established who you are, this third seal establishes what cannot be changed or altered by any circumstance or appearance in the temporary world of physical experience, and these words carry the authority of eternal law that recognizes no exception and yields to no contrary evidence. I am a natural receiver. I have always received, and it cannot be otherwise. Let these words flow through you with the power of cosmic law and divine decree, and feel them establishing an unshakable foundation of knowing that will support you through any appearance of challenge or limitation, because you now know that these appearances are only temporary shadows that have no real substance or power to affect your true spiritual reality as a permanent resident of the temple where infinite supply flows eternally. I am a natural receiver. I have always received, and it cannot be otherwise. Receive these words as the final establishment of your divine identity and your permanent access to unlimited abundance, and know that they are being written in the book of your soul in letters of golden light that can never be erased or dimmed by any experience in the physical world, because they describe eternal truth that exists beyond time and space and circumstance. I am a natural receiver. I have always received, and it cannot be otherwise. Feel these words settling into the deepest levels of your being, where they will operate continuously to align your consciousness with the truth of divine supply and to attract into your experience the perfect manifestation of everything you need for your highest happiness and greatest service to the good of all creation. Because when you live from this recognition, you become a channel through which infinite abundance flows, not only to you, but through you, to bless everyone whose life you touch. And now the sealing is complete, and you can rest in the absolute certainty that what has been established tonight in the realm of divine consciousness will begin to manifest in your physical experience with perfect timing, and in ways that will demonstrate the unlimited love and provision of the source that created you and sustains you and provides for you with endless generosity and joy. You can continue sleeping peacefully, knowing that everything that needed to enter your consciousness has already entered, and everything that needed to be sealed has been sealed, and everything that needed to be activated has been activated. And when you wake in the morning, you will find that something fundamental has shifted in your relationship to abundance and provision, because you will know yourself as a permanent resident of the inner temple, where lack and limitation cannot exist. You are no longer someone who seeks abundance, but someone who lives abundance, and you are no longer someone who hopes for provision, but someone who knows provision as your natural inheritance, and you are no longer someone who struggles with lack, but someone who expresses the infinite supply that flows through you. As naturally as light flows from the sun and water flows in rivers toward the sea. Rest now in the perfect peace of completion, and let your body and mind integrate these profound changes while your soul celebrates the homecoming that has taken place tonight, because you have not gained something new, but have remembered something eternal, and you have not become someone different, but have recognized who you have always been. beneath every appearance to the contrary. The words have been spoken, and the seal has been established, and the recognition is complete. And you are now and forever a dwelling place of divine abundance, where every good thing finds its perfect expression, and every need is met before it arises, and every desire is fulfilled in ways that bring joy, not only to you, but to all creation, because your prosperity serves the highest good, and your abundance blesses everyone whose life is touched by the radiance of divine love that flows through you. It is finished, and it is done, and it cannot be otherwise, and so it is now and always and forevermore.